So understanding the self and theories of self-knowledge continue to elicit intrigue in the study of ethics. However, one perennial struggle around this topic is clarifying what role other people have in attaining self-knowledge. On the surface, the term self-knowledge does not immediately infer that others are involved in this interior pursuit of coming to know oneself. We typically believe that we know ourselves best, and others may provide counsel or influence, but ultimately the process of self-knowledge is up to us. Furthermore, perhaps the most commonly deferred to resource on the topic of self-knowledge are existentialist writers, such as Jean-Paul Sartre. He thinks, for example, that we should greatly emphasize the need to know oneself and begin creating ourselves, yet he infers that this is largely an individualistic and isolated project without reference to pre-established values, traditions, or roles. On Sartre's picture, it is especially difficult to see what the role of others or your community is in finding self-knowledge. So in an attempt to offer an account of self-knowledge that emphasizes the role of others in the pursuit of self-knowledge, and an account altogether different than the existentialist paradigm we are somewhat used to hearing, I'm going to turn to St. Thomas Aquinas. To articulate his account of self-knowledge, I combine Aquinas' writings on self-knowledge found in the Summa Theologica, also his biblical commentaries, and his writings on the perfection of the spiritual life. I find that there are three defining features of his account. First, I find that his account offers parameters for the way in which we should gain self-knowledge and the limits of the pursuit. Second, Aquinas' account provides foundations of the self, which is rooted in a set of desires shared by all people. Third, I argue his account emphasizes the essential role that others play in the pursuit of self-knowledge. And he does this through his emphasis on charity, the role of friendship, and the goal of self-knowledge. Last, by way of bringing clarity to Aquinas' conception of self-knowledge, I compare his ideas with Sartre's conception of self-knowledge, as seen in his famous writing, Existentialism is a Humanism. So in what follows, I hope to bring to light the three essential components of Aquinas' old and often underdeveloped account of self-knowledge. So let me begin. Part 1, how we come to know ourselves. Does Aquinas really have a formal account of self-knowledge? Not exactly. As Aquinas scholar Matthew Kruger writes, the formal question of whether or how a person can know their self is not directly asked in Aquinas, nor would that be expected. The closest approximation of this question can be seen in the Summa, Part 1, question 87, that asks how the intellectual soul knows itself and all within itself. Throughout his response to this question, Thomas offers a clear overriding principle. He writes, everything is knowable so far as it is in act, and not so far as it is in potentiality. Furthermore, Aquinas explains that the soul is in potentiality, and that it is only knowable when it is in action or takes action. For example, a person can know whether or not they have the habit of being envious. They cannot know that they have the habit of being envious just by thinking about their soul and their desires. Rather, they know they have that habit of being envious by observing their actions, their intentions, and their affections. Over time, once we see repeated actions, an awareness grows that allows us to know ourselves, namely our soul's habits, its desires and affections seen through activity. It is important to note that Aquinas thinks there is a limit to what we can know about ourselves through observation, and that limit is regarding our intentions. Aquinas thinks that we can know our intentions insofar as we have knowledge of the end that we will. For example, he explains intention, quote, belongs first and principally to that which moves us to an end. Hence, we say that an architect or someone who has authority by his command moves others to that which he intends. What that means is we know our intentions just as an architect does who intends to build a building and directs himself as well as others towards that end. However, it's important to note that for Aquinas, not all our intentions are accessible to us. In his commentary on Hebrews 4, Aquinas makes clear that he does not think we have direct access to our intentions. For what man does or thinks is manifest through works, but by what intention he does this is utterly uncertain. These things, however, are not unknown to God. In his commentary on Psalms, Thomas again discusses the lack of human access to intention. He writes, there are three kinds of examining concerning man. One is visible, that is an exterior work, and there are two that are hidden, namely intention and delight. These two are hidden to us, but they lie open to God. For Aquinas, we can know ourselves only through our actions, and this knowledge can reveal our desires and affections. Yet at some level, only God can know our intentions and the source of our delight. In other words, when it comes to some intentions that stem from taking delight in God or in others, these intentions are hidden from us, but knowable to God. What this amounts to for our purposes is that part of the process of knowing oneself fully, knowing one's desires, delights, intentions, and affections, requires a relationship with God. For he has the power to reveal the intentions of your heart that are inaccessible to us. Aquinas emphasizes that we need God's grace in order to come to know who we are at our deepest held delights and intentions. So far, wrapping up part 1, we see that Aquinas thinks we understand ourselves empirically. We must observe our actions and become aware of our habits over time. Furthermore, dependence on God for full self-knowledge is necessary because many of our deepest held intentions and delights are in our hearts and only knowable by God, who has the power to reveal them to us through our relationship with him. So comparing this picture briefly to the existentialist picture drawn by Sartre would agree that Aquinas that we come to know ourselves empirically through what we do and not just by what we believe. Yet unlike Aquinas, Sartre does not think we should depend on anyone or any deity to help us in the process of gaining self-knowledge. Rather, for Sartre, if we are to live authentically, we must acknowledge that each person is completely in charge of creating him or herself, choosing what she wishes to be. As we will next see, Aquinas could not disagree more with Sartre on the necessary role of God and others in coming to know oneself. In fact, Aquinas pretty outright rejects Sartre's famous statement that existence must precede essence. Let's move on to part 2. Part 2 of Aquinas' account of self-knowledge, the foundations of self-knowledge. I would be amiss in explaining Aquinas' account of self-knowledge if I did not talk about the foundations of the self, which ultimately depend on the self's creator, God. For Aquinas, we are all created by God, with certain desires for the infinite. Though we come to know ourselves through growing in awareness of our thoughts and actions over time, ultimately Aquinas thinks that the work of self-knowledge is not a process of creating the self into whatever we want, as Sartre would have it. Rather, Aquinas grounds the human person in a fundamental truth that God, in his image, made us. In particular, Aquinas thinks God structured our desires in such a way that both our fulfillment and knowing of ourselves are attained in loving God with all our hearts and all our minds. As he lays out in his treatise on happiness, part of being human is having a set of desires or appetites for the good. But more specifically, humans have a desire to have a perfect good that fulfills the desires of our heart completely. That good is God. The end of our desires, written into our hearts, according to Aquinas, is only found in love, particularly love that transcends oneself and others and reaches into the infinite. It's a love of God. Thus, loving God with our whole heart and loving our neighbor from the outpour of God's love is where the fulfillment of our human desire rests. So one way to capture what the self really is for Aquinas is in light of the essence of how God structured our desires. Our soul finds fulfillment in loving God with all our heart and mind. In this light, Aquinas' conception of self-knowledge is principally concerned with realizing this truth about the self and working to align our actions and our intentions and desires with this truth. As a result, self-knowledge entails realizing this fundamental truth that is true of all human beings. Our desires are for God. Find fulfillment in God. At this point, you might wonder, how exactly are we supposed to realize this fundamental notion of the self, that is, that our desires are designed to find fulfillment in a loving God, when so many of us do not seem to realize this? In answering this question, Aquinas did not shy away from outright stating that even if someone never realizes this about themselves, that their desires are structured in this way, it still remains true of them that the fulfillment of their desires is had in loving God. He writes that many people seek their ultimate end in a good such as a tranquil spirit or knowledge of science. But Aquinas thinks it remains true that only God, only love of God, will fulfill their soul's desires completely. Even if they remain ignorant of this truth, it's still true of them. He writes, humans do not all agree on the ultimate end. Some desire wealth as their full and complete good, whereas others desire pleasure. But these people mistakenly seek their ultimate end in these things. For after all, the good that is ultimate end is a complete good that totally satisfies the appetite. What satisfies the human appetite and deepest desires for Aquinas is found in loving God. Only in loving God will the soul reach its potential for fulfillment. How then do we realize this truth about the self and its desires for Aquinas? How do we realize this? Is it through observing our actions over time? Though Aquinas does not answer this exact important question, he does make clear that coming to know oneself happens in a moral and spiritual growth process, a process of changing our desires towards loving God. He writes, the first step in that process is directing one's intentions to God. Turn ye to me, and I will turn to you. Aquinas says that we must turn to God, and in so doing, we begin that process that, if done continually, enables us to grow in love of God and realize the fundamental truths about our desires, namely, that we desire the infinite, at God as our perfect good. Thomas re-articulates this idea in his spiritual writing on perfection, where he repeatedly emphasizes that the spiritual life is about the love of God. And we love God, quote, if there is nothing with which we do not actually or habitually refer to God. By continually ordering our actions, our intentions, our desires to the love of God, we begin to change our desires and also come to see the truth of our desires, that we are fulfilled in loving God. Helpful to filling in what Aquinas has in mind here, this process of change and realization about the self, is to recognize his heavy reliance on Aristotelian account of habituation. For Aristotle, we both become virtuous and realize that virtues are good, or that they fulfill our capacities as rational animals, when we practice doing virtuous actions over time. So we both realize that we both become virtuous and that virtues are good by doing virtuous action. So too does Aquinas think that the practice of ordering our desires and intentions to the love of God over time enables us to change and realize that this act is fulfilling our deepest desires. The work of practicing turning toward God reveals the truth about who we are, namely beings whose fulfillment is found in loving God with all our heart and mind. In this light, we can see how Aquinas maintains both that we come to know ourselves through observing our habits and actions, but ultimately the work of observing our actions is for the end of directing our intentions towards loving God in all that we do. The work of gaining knowledge of our actions by observing our habits is useful for the larger task of growing into the fullness of who the self is, as grounded in God's image. Now, it may already be quite apparent how different this aspect of Aquinas' thought on self-knowledge is from a more contemporary idea, especially the existentialist conception of self-knowledge. For an existentialist such as Sartre, the self has no foundation in God or pre-established nature. The work of coming to know oneself, Sartre says, requires that one discover one's essence, which can only be done by first existing. He writes, what do we mean by existence precedes essence? He writes, we mean that we must first exist. He materializes in the world, encounters himself, and only afterward defines himself. If man as existentialists conceive of himself cannot be defined, it is because, to begin with, he is nothing. He will not be anything until later, and then he will be what he makes of himself. It is quite clear that for Sartre, there is not a human nature or God giving us an essence. Man comes to know himself only after first existing and proceeds to make and define himself on his own. Aquinas' depiction is altogether opposite this view and provides the exact depiction of essence, or a depiction of the soul that is predefined by God for all humans that precedes existence. What is worth noting in this comparison, however, is how Aquinas does not deny that man must first choose for himself to follow the path to realization of the self. Even though the self has certain fundamental desires that structure the soul's fulfillment, this reality becomes apparent to us as we begin choosing to act through faith in directing our intentions to God. Self-knowledge requires that we choose consistently over time to vigilantly direct our desires and intentions towards love of God, so that there be nothing in us which is wanting of divine love. This realization of the self as created by God and in relationship with God still requires choice, action, and faith on the part of the believer. The essence we all share as humans for Aquinas does not take away from our ability to choose for ourselves whether we want to live our lives in accordance with this truth about our desires. In fact, this reality about what fulfills us is one we must continually choose and grow into over time in order to fully realize who we are. Let me now move on to the third and final aspect of Aquinas' concept of self-knowledge, the role of others in gaining self-knowledge. So a final aspect of Aquinas' conception of self-knowledge that I want to emphasize is his emphasis on the role of others. To begin, I want to note how his emphasis on the role of others is quite different, again, from Sartre's account of self-knowledge. According to Sartre, the work of making oneself must be done largely in isolation, away from the pressures, values, and freedom-stealing gaze of other people. Though Sartre states that the other people is essential to the knowledge I have of myself, a curious statement, what he principally means by that is that others have a freedom, just as he does, to create themselves and what they choose to do with that freedom can help or hinder one's own freedom. On this account, I want to point out that other people, the role other people have in working in the work of self-knowledge remains severely limited. The other is helpful to one's project of knowing and making oneself just when the other does not become an obstacle or impose on one's freedom. As a result, Sartre's idea of self-knowledge is largely individualistic and isolationist. Aquinas' account, on the other hand, states that others are central to the work of coming to know oneself. His account emphasizes several roles for others. Here I will highlight 3 such roles. First, I find that for Aquinas, loving others is a central way to love God. Second, friendship is crucial to accurate self-knowledge and staying motivated along the path to self-knowledge. And thirdly, Aquinas thinks that part of the very goal of self-knowledge is for the benefit of the other. To begin, as we have seen, Aquinas makes clear that self-knowledge is realized and fulfilled when we orient ourselves towards the love of God. Yet a central component of loving God for Aquinas is found in conjunction with loving one's neighbor. Aquinas writes in his Disputed Questions on Charity that God is found in others, and thus loving God in others is a crucial way of coming to love God. Aquinas writes, "For our neighbor is loved by charity because God is in him and might be in him, and thus we love God by loving our neighbor for God's sake." Aquinas makes clear that we find God in others, in our fellow believers, in strangers we meet, our closest friends, and in the neighbors, and our neighbors more generally. In loving others, we find and love God. Moreover, we find the strength to love others well because we see and know the God that made and rest in the soul of the other. In sum, just as coming to know and fulfill the desires of the self involves coming to love God, so too does self-knowledge require coming to love our neighbor. The other remains essential to loving God. Moving now to the second way that others are involved in the process of coming to know ourselves, Aquinas emphasizes the role friends have in helping us gain an accurate picture of ourselves. In his commentary on Aristotle's Ethics, Book 9, Aquinas writes, we can examine our neighbors better than ourselves, and their actions better than our own, because every man is a bad judge of his own case on account of the private affection he has for himself. Since a man's friend is another self, so to speak, the friend's actions will be his own in a sense. Similar to Aristotle, Aquinas thinks friends can help us see ourselves in unbiased and thus more accurate ways. In Daniel Schwartz's book, Aquinas on Friendship, he writes, "The happy person needs the help of his friends, also for his own performance of right works, in both his active and contemplative life, since we are less biased towards our friends than towards ourselves, and friends are similar to ourselves. We can, by looking at them, look at ourselves in a less biased way." Seeing as self-knowledge comes about by assessing our active lives and our actions and affections, having an unbiased view of our actions is essential in gaining an accurate understanding of ourselves. In friendship, we can't get away with the inflated picture we hold of ourselves. In relationship with friends, however, we find out things like we're not as good at loving each other as we thought, or even in loving God as we thought. Yet such facts are only revealed in relationship between people who desire to love and do good to each other. Aquinas makes clear that friends of this sort are essential to achieving an accurate grasp on our habits, our achievements, our affections, all of which make up the knowledge we have of ourselves. However, providing an unbiased assessment is not all friends are necessary for. According to Aquinas, friends play a crucial role in helping us to actually stay motivated and enthusiastic about the pursuit of spiritual and moral growth. Seeing as self-knowledge requires vigilantly changing our desires and our affections over time to align with our our desire for God. Aquinas admits that this is a process that takes continued, renewed motivation. Friendship is a crucial resource for the motivation to pursue the virtuous life. Aquinas writes, "The happy man needs friends. The purpose of a good operation, that he may do good to them, that he may delight in seeing them do good, and again, that he may be helped by them in his good work. For in the other man may do well, for in order that man may do well, whether in works of the active life or in those of the contemplative life, he needs the fellowship of friends." Daniel Schwartz, again, fleshes out Aquinas' position here. He writes, "Aquinas thinks the happy life demands the permanent availability of the resources which allow virtuous operation. Friendship is said to be one such resource. Without friendship, the continuity of virtuous operation would be impaired, and one would be likely to lose enthusiasm for an interest in the activity of virtuous living. The virtuous person will find it difficult to act virtuously continuously unless she experiences enjoyment in such activity. Friends' virtuous activity is one of the vital sources of enjoyment. Through our friends, we expand our capacity to perform virtuous deeds because friends are united to ourselves in such a way that their actions are, in some way, also ours." I think Schwartz nicely articulates that friends help not only to keep our judgments of ourselves unbiased, but also to keep us uplifted and motivated and encouraged along a very long and difficult path towards directing our whole self to loving God, where full self-knowledge is found. So a third and final important way that Aquinas emphasizes the role of others in self-knowledge is by making clear that part of the very goal of self-knowledge is for the benefit of the other. Aquinas thinks that the work of examining oneself must not stop at ourself, but is a knowledge that we must extend beyond ourself to help others. We must gain knowledge not just to know ourselves, but to educate, inform, and spur on those around us. Aquinas articulates that the work of examining oneself carries the responsibility to examine others and to direct them back to the path of life. In his commentary on the letter of the Hebrews, he writes, "Watch, therefore, brothers, as to whatever is in yourself, since everyone is part of the community, and each one is commanded by God concerning his neighbor. Watch, that is, examine one another, lest perhaps something is in you. Exhort one another every day, that is, continuously scrutinizing their consciences and inducing them to the good." Aquinas emphasizes that the watchfulness over our own actions and thoughts is not just to serve ourself and grow in self-knowledge, but should also extend to watchfulness, attention, and encouragement for others. Implied is that in coming to understand our own actions, inclinations, and faults, we are prepared. It prepares us to watch over and redirect our neighbors back to the path of life, of self-knowledge. In other words, the very end or goal of self-knowledge for Aquinas, in large part, is not just for ourselves, it is to benefit others. We must extend our watchfulness and knowledge to our community, to guide and encourage others to pursue virtue, to seek to know and to love God, and to find fulfillment therein. Returning very briefly to compare with Sartre's view, needless to say, Aquinas' three central roles for others in his account of self-knowledge is very different than the Sartrean picture. Aquinas recognizes no need to escape from others, as Sartre does. In fact, for Aquinas, escaping and isolating oneself from others prevents one from achieving self-knowledge, which requires loving our neighbors, seeking their friendship, and encouraging them in the work of coming to know themselves and God. The other remains essential for Aquinas. Furthermore, because the self is grounded in an understanding of a common, shared human desire, Aquinas has room to say that our knowledge of ourself can and should help others along the shared path we have to life. In fact, one could argue that Aquinas himself models helping others in this way. The rigorous detail and breadth of his writing on the self, his interior life, and all its inner dimensions, which he came to know from his careful self-reflection, have gone on to spur on millions of people down the path to a better understanding of themselves and their relationship to one another. In conclusion, it is my hope to have presented three components of Aquinas' conception of self-knowledge and to highlight the essential role others play in achieving self-knowledge. In so doing, I hope to have shown how different Aquinas' account is from Sartre's, yet refreshingly so. Aquinas teaches us that self-knowledge need not be self-centered, isolated affair. And in fact, it cannot be if we are to reach our human potential. Aquinas reminds us that when we acknowledge foundational shared human desires that make up who we are, we have a basis on which to begin inviting others into our work of coming to know ourselves and encouraging others along the path to fulfilling our shared desires. Aquinas teaches us finally that we must depend on others for support, encouragement, unbiased assessment, and the shared realization that loving others is a crucial way to love God. Thank you.
I was just curious if Aquinas has any requirements for our friends in order for them to be good judges of our actions, or like in general. Like I could imagine like in an example when you're seeking counsel from a friend to help you better understand yourself, but they actually further that process from being able to happen by giving you bad counsel in some way. So I'm just curious if he has any requirements. If not, maybe what do you think they would be?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking it.
Yeah.
So in studying how friendship impacts your ability to come to know yourself and have an accurate understanding of yourself, I noticed Aquinas definitely has parameters for the kinds of friends he thinks can do this work. It's definitely a friend he considers to be a kind of other self. And in that other self is they have a purity about what's good. You have a shared vision about what's good. You both seek virtue and a common understanding of what that virtue is. And you have a very unselfish love. So the person you're turning to for the unbiased assessment and the kind of intimate, sharing that's necessary is definitely someone who you have an intimate relationship. There's a lot of trust. There's a lot of shared vision about what's good. Very important to remember, not all friends you might have experienced in your own lives direct us to an accurate understanding of ourselves. And such friends actually are hard to find and take years to work up such a relationship. But Aquinas thinks finding them is essential. Vince, you had a question.
I was actually going to ask something about Sartre in relation to this. So when you talked about the gaze and the other kind of infringing on our freedom of self-creation, self-knowledge, I've always, probably mistakenly, I guess, thought of the gaze in Sartre as kind of a tool of self-creation, that you create yourself in relation to others. So is it really this limiting factor, or does he also have this place for the other to contribute to our identity?
Good.
And maybe in relation to the famous quote of where he says, if God exists, I'm not free, that kind of competitiveness that he's kind of assuming is going on between agents, especially one who's supremely powerful.
Sure. So thank you for that question. The primary source I had for this paper, and where I referenced Sartre, was his famous writing, Existentialism as a Humanism. And in that, he makes some curious statements about how the other is, quote, essential to my coming to know myself. But in looking further into that statement, really, and most statements where he's like saying the other helps you form your own identity, I find that what he means by that is the other represents a radical freedom, just like you have. And in confronting the other, what you're really confronting is not necessarily like who that other is, but the fact that that other person has a radical freedom like your own. So it kind of reconfirms the thing about yourself that he finds truest, which is we're radically free and must create ourselves. And to the extent the other is involved in that process of helping or hurting, it's really by way of you're free, I'm free, you're taking up your project, I am too. Let's be mindful and not get in each other's way here, right? Yeah, that's what I take from it. Any other questions or thoughts you guys have about it?
I've got a super off-the-wall question.
Sure, if you want.
All right, sure. It's about, it's totally relating Sartre and Aquinas, so it's maybe helpful. So, talking about Sartre's idea of the individual of existence preceding essence, and the individual is radically free. He talks in terms of existence and essence. So I figure why not add another Thomistic metaphysical framework and say in terms of act and potency.
It seems like he's saying that the individual is purely actual, being existence itself, but then also purely potential in that it could potentially become anything. So it seems like we've got pure actuality, pure potentiality, same thing which has no essence, and lots of confusions. So
Are you articulating Aquinas' idea of the self?
I'm trying to criticize Sartre as if I'm Aquinas, I guess, which is usually my way of doing things. Thoughts?
I'm not quite sure how Sartre and Aquinas, like, I don't know. I think that Sartre is utterly confusing when you get down to it. He likes to say a lot of things that I think are quite contradictory. But I do think that Aquinas is helpful in saying that, look, we're not necessarily born knowing ourselves fully, and it's definitely a process of taking our potential to know ourselves and bringing it into actualization. And we do that through taking intentional actions. And those intentional actions are towards loving others and loving God. And in taking that path, you actualize that potential. And you also come to the realization that this is true of me. You know, these are how my desires are structured. This is where fulfillment is found. He's very confident in the path of taking actions in light of love of God, brings with it this kind of realization about who you are. I didn't go into it, but he has a whole conception of leaving the old person and going into the new self. Part of the spiritual and moral growth is developing into that new self only through taking intentional action and loving others.